So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to write the Song of Achilles. Actually, the roots of the novel go all the way back to my very, very early childhood, because my mother used to read the Greek myths to me, and the Iliad in particular, as bedtime stories. And she always kind of hates it when I tell that story, because she thinks it makes her sound really inappropriate. But I loved these stories so much. And from the moment that she began reading, Sing Goddess of the Terrible Rage of Achilles, I was completely hooked on these stories. And I think that what really drew me to them, of course there were the battles, and there were the gods, and there were the exciting adventures, but I think that what I really liked was the fact that Achilles himself is not a perfect hero. That right from that first line that talks about his intense and destructive rage, we know that this is a real person. This is a person with deep faults, who makes a series of disastrous choices throughout the Iliad. And I felt like I was getting a glimpse of something like real life. And that was partially what was so exciting to me, and continued to be exciting. And I was very fortunate to have a Latin teacher in high school who also knew ancient Greek, and he told me that I could teach, that he could teach me Homer in about a year and have me reading the Iliad in the original. So I said, yes, please, and we immediately kind of embarked on that. And so by the time I got to college, I already had some Greek under my belt. I'd been doing Latin. And the whole time that all this was going on, I was studying classics. I decided I was going to major in it. Also, as if it were split screen, over here I had my writing. And I never even considered that I would write a novel about classics. It was like they were two totally separate disciplines. There was my writing that I had always loved, and there was classics that I had always loved. But what changed that was my senior year of college. A friend of mine asked me to co-direct Troilus and Cressida, which is Shakespeare's Iliad play. And if you haven't seen it or read it, and you like the Greek myths, I totally recommend it. It is dark and funny, and Shakespeare really lets the Greek commanders have it on pretty much every page. So I started to direct that, and I just found it so intellectually exciting to be participating in telling these stories, not just reading them on the page, but actively meeting with Achilles and talking with him about his character and costuming Agamemnon and doing the big sword fight between Achilles and Hector, and getting to participate in that was just this intellectual revelation for me. And when that play ended, I thought, I don't really want this to end. I want to keep telling these stories and participating in them. And almost sort of in a trance, I sat down in front of the laptop, opened it, and started writing Patroclus' voice. And it really was always Patroclus from the beginning. I never thought about Achilles, doing it from his perspective, or doing another story. I loved the character so much, and part of what I loved about him was the fact that he was a little bit mysterious, that there isn't very much in the Iliad about Patroclus. You see how important he is to Achilles because of Achilles' intense grief when Patroclus dies. But other than that, you just get these little mentions here and there, but they're very tantalizing. And one of the reasons I found them tantalizing is that Achilles is the best of the Greek warriors. He's supposed to be, the most ferocious, the most beautiful, and his companion, who's referred to as his most beloved companion, Patroclus, is described as gentle, always gentle, in fact. Not just by one person, who was the slave woman Briseis, but also by Menelaus, the king, husband of Helen. And I found that really interesting, because if you know the Greek myths, you know that gentleness, not a common quality among ancient Greek heroes. So I thought, well, what is it? Maybe this has something to do with why Achilles is so attached to him. Homer doesn't show us very much about their bond. He kind of just shows the end, what happens when Patroclus dies. But it's all clearly under there. It's kind of like an iceberg. Clearly there's this huge backstory between them, and what is that story? And so I basically set that moment, that terrible grief-stricken moment where Achilles finds out Patroclus is dead on my horizon, and I wrote towards it. I thought, who is this Patroclus? Can I imagine him? So it was really a love story, and the story of the two of them from the beginning. So I'm going to read, one of the passages I'm going to read is a short section when the two are boys. They're about 11 years old, and they've met, because Patroclus was actually also born a prince, just like Achilles was. But when he's very young, he accidentally kills another boy and is exiled from his kingdom and taken in as sort of a charity case by Achilles. And so the section I'm going to read is after that's happened and they've started to become friends. Our friendship came all at once after that, like spring floods from the mountains. Before the boys and I had imagined that his days were filled with princely instruction, statecraft and spear. But I had long since learned the truth. Other than his lyre lessons and his drills, he had no instruction. One day we might go swimming, another we might climb trees. We made up games for ourselves, racing and tumbling. We would lie on the warm sand and say, "Guess what I'm thinking about?" The falcon we had seen from our window, the boy with the crooked front tooth, dinner. And as we swam, or played, or talked, a feeling would come. It was almost like fear in the way it filled me, rising in my chest. It was almost like tears in how swiftly it came. But it was neither of those. Buoyant where they were heavy, and bright where they were dull. I had known contentment before, brief snatches of time in which I pursued solitary pleasure, skipping stones or dicing or dreaming. But in truth it had been less a presence than an absence, a laying aside of dread. My father was not near, nor boys. I was not hungry, nor tired, nor sick. This feeling was different. I found myself grinning until my cheeks hurt, my scalp prickling till I thought it might lift off my head. My tongue ran away from me, giddy with freedom. This and this and this, I said to him. I did not have to fear that I spoke too much. I did not have to worry that I was too slender or too slow. This and this and this. I taught him how to skip stones, and he taught me how to carve wood. I could feel every nerve in my body, every brush of air against my skin. He played my mother's lyre, and I watched. When it was my turn to play, my fingers tangled in the strings, and the teacher despaired of me. I did not care. Play again, I told him, and he played until I could barely see his fingers in the dark. I saw then how I had changed. I did not mind anymore that I lost when we raced, and I lost when we swam out to the rocks, and I lost when we tossed spears or skipped stones. For who can be ashamed to lose to such beauty? It was enough to watch him win, to see the soles of his feet flashing as they kicked up sand, or the rise and fall of his shoulders as he pulled through the salt. It was enough. So, thank you. One of the other things that I was thinking about as I was writing this is I was very conscious of sort of genre and historical fiction, and was this going to be sort of in the genre of historical fiction? And I knew that when you approach, kind of from doing reading on my own, that when you approach one of these ancient works and you're going to adapt it, you come to this crossroads pretty early on. And the crossroads is, are you going to have centaurs in your novel or not? Are you going to put the gods in there? And so I quickly came to the decision, didn't even really feel like a decision, that yes, absolutely, that the gods and the centaurs and all those sort of kind of fantastical elements that are part of Achilles' story felt completely central to me. And that I wasn't going to try and get back to an actual Bronze Age Mycenaean world. I was taking Homer's world, a poetic world, as my world. And that's what I was going to be writing in. And that turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful gift to me, because Homer is an incredibly generous I don't know if I should call him an author, composer, poet. His world is so big and full and rich, and it kind of sees the little things down here and the huge things up here, that he really welcomes adaptation. That there was never a moment where I felt like I was fighting with him or struggling with him. He was incredibly expansive and incredibly generous to be working from that text, even though the actual Iliad just covers a very short period of time in my story. It's actually just kind of somewhere around 50 pages towards the end of the story. But it was the characters and the idea and the feel of the world that was incredibly important to me. So I definitely wanted those gods in there. And that became very important because there are two major gods that play a really important role in Achilles' story. One is Chiron, the only good centaur, who is kind of the amazing civilized teacher. He teaches heroes in music and art and healing, and he's this incredible kind of force for civilization and thoughtfulness. And then there was Thetis, who is Achilles' sea nymph goddess mother. So the next section I'm going to read is a short section also from the first time that Patroclus, again around age 11, meets Achilles' sea nymph mother. The next night, when the household slept, I climbed out of our window. The moon was half full, bright enough for me to pick my way over the rocks without a torch. He had said that I was to stand in the surf and she would come. No, he had reassured me. You do not need to speak. She will know. The waves were warm and thick with sand. I shifted, watched the small white crabs run through the surf. I was listening, thinking I might hear the splash of her feet as she approached. A breeze blew down the beach, and grateful, I closed my eyes to it. When I opened them again, she was standing before me. She was taller than I was, taller than any woman I had ever seen. Her black hair was loose down her back, and her skin shone luminous and impossibly pale, as if it drank light from the moon. She was so close I could smell her, seawater laced with dark brown honey. I did not breathe. I did not dare. You are Patroclus. I flinched at the sound of her voice, hoarse and rasping. I had expected chimes, not the grinding of rocks in the surf. Yes, lady. Distaste ran over her face. Her eyes were not like a human's. They were black to their center and flecked with gold. I could not bring myself to meet them. He will be a god, she said. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. She leaned forward and I half thought she might touch me, but of course she did not. Do you understand? I could feel her breath on my cheek, not warm at all, but chill like the depths of the sea. Do you understand? He had told me, too, that she hated to be kept waiting. Yes. She leaned closer still, looming over me. Her mouth was a gash of red, like the torn open stomach of a sacrifice, bloody and oracular. Behind it, her teeth shone sharp and white as bone. Good. Carelessly, as if to herself, she added, You will be dead soon enough. She turned and dove into the sea, leaving no ripples behind her. So I can talk about a lot more things about the book in terms of my research or how my sort of road to publication, but if people have specific questions, I would actually love to make sure I'm talking about what you're interested in hearing about. So if people want to jump in, please.
More to what you were talking about with choosing to write about centaurs, how did you choose to characterize like the other main characters? Like Agamemnon can be nicer or meaner, Hector can be a brute or not. So how did you decide to, or like Neoptolemus, like he can be nicer or not? So how did you choose to make him a jerk?
So Neoptolemus is also goes by the name Pyrrhus, and he's Achilles' son, who shows up He's conceived right before Achilles goes to war, then he shows up in the last year of the war. So there's a little bit of a time problem there in the mythology, but because the war is only 10 years long, and then he shows up as the next most ferocious warrior. But it's true that there are a lot of different stories about these heroes, and you can kind of pick and choose to make them more villainous, less villainous, and it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision how I was doing it. I feel very fortunate about this book because all the research I did for it, I did having no idea that I was doing it for the book. I did it because I was studying it, I was writing papers on it because I loved the material. And so it was all kind of lurking in there. And even when I wasn't sure about a particular detail, I pretty much knew where to go to find it. So in terms of Neoptolemus in particular, who you mentioned, it's true that in many of the Greek traditions, he's actually a much more positive character. But Virgil, who is my other huge ancient, my huge ancient literary love, chooses to really bring out Pyrrhus's savagery and cruelty. So that was my nod to Virgil on that one.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. Did you, I mean, the love story is beautiful between the two of them, and did you give any thought to the Erastes-Romanos relationship, or did that influence the way that you portrayed the characters, and are we to understand that Patroclus is the Erastes and Achilles is the Romanos, or is it the other way around? And then maybe an add-on to that question, is there, like, does Patroclus play like some kind of didactic role that Achilles is supposed to learn, and does he learn it?
Sure. So the Erastes and Romanos that she was referencing has to do with kind of the type of classical male-male relationships that have come down to us most popularly kind of in the scholarship, which is really kind of focusing on the 5th century Athens cultural norms, where you have an older man who is established in society, kind of knows government, often has been to war, and then you have a younger, beloved, beautiful man who the older one is kind of inducting into all the things of the civic society, as well as sort of a relationship. And those relationships it's hard to get back to exactly how romantic or sexual those relationships might have been, but the names, as you pointed out, were lover and beloved. And actually, those did influence me to some extent, in the sense that I wanted to get away from them. Yeah, because I feel like that people sort of in scholarship talk so much about 5th century Athens and that lover-beloved dynamic, the older man, younger man, the powerful man, the beautiful man, that they kind of forget that Homer was, composing many, many years before that, about a time period that was even 500 years before that. And so I think it's hard to sort of apply those 5th century Athens norms onto a relationship that in Homer is just something else entirely. And it's funny, actually, because the 5th century Athenians would often debate about this. And they would say, so Achilles is the powerful one, he's the warrior, he's the strong guy, so he has to be the lover. He's the established guy, he's the older guy. But wait a minute, he's the most beautiful. So he has to be the younger one. Oh, this doesn't work. So, the part of what I want to bring in is that even though that's kind of the stereotype of male-male love in the ancient world that's come down to us, that there were many, many other time periods, many other places, many other ways of being in a relationship. And, we don't have to kind of stick it all in that type. And I think on top of that I was inspired a little bit also by Homer himself, that in the Iliad, one of the things that's amazing about the interactions between Achilles and Patroclus, and there aren't very many of them, is how equal they are, even though Patroclus has basically no status. That he's this exile, he sort of is there as Achilles' companion. Achilles is kind of storming around the camp and being angry and doing his thing, but that when Patroclus speaks to him, he's not deferential at all. He speaks to him absolutely as an equal, as an emotional equal. And I feel like that was really what I wanted to honor, and that the Erastes and Romanos kind of takes us into this territory of inequality that I didn't want to go in that direction. It was a very long answer.
No, that's great, thank you.
Yes.
I listened to the novel, and the reader was quite extraordinary.
Oh.
Have you heard it?
I haven't heard it, but I should listen to
I
it.
haven't read it. And one of the extraordinary things about it was the way he created the character of Thetis. And whenever she appeared, I was terrified to listen. The way he changed his voice, and it was really wonderful. And as I knew we would meet Thetis, I thought, how do you create a character who's not human? You know, how did you think about Thetis and create her?
Well, I really wanted to honor that, how frightening the gods were in the ancient world. That we sort of think of them almost as comic figures in some senses, but that they were really, really frightening, and in some sense deeply unnatural. That they were the ones who never die, and that for humans to be around them was a profoundly uncomfortable thing, and that when humans and gods mixed, it was always meant disaster for humans. You know, and you kind of think of the story that was in my mind as I was creating the character of Thetis was the story of where Zeus reveals himself in his full glory and incinerates Semele, and that sort of was the feel I wanted. Is that feeling of how uncomfortable and difficult and frightening it is to be in front of the gods. But at the same time, I was also interested in the hierarchical structure of the gods. That you have Zeus up here, and Thetis is actually way down here. She has very little power, although she's terrifying to humans. In the world of gods, she actually is in a very difficult situation. And she, even though she's a goddess, and you would think that she would be able to save her own son, she can't. And she sort of spends her whole immortality working towards saving Achilles, and she isn't able to do it in the end. And so I was also drawn to her in a way that was, I felt very empathetic towards her, at the same time that I wanted her to be terrifying. So even though she is kind of the antagonist in the book, I never saw her as villainous in any way.
Comes across very well.
The way that you continue the narrative after Patroclus dies and you still keep his voice particularly evocative, and I remember thinking when I was reading the book, okay, how is the book going to end? Is she going to end it with Patroclus' death, or is she going to continue after Achilles' death? And when I read the chapter after he died, I was surprised at how fluid and smooth the transition was. How did you sort of tackle continuing the novel after he dies in his voice?
It was something that I thought a lot about, because sort of knowing that your main character narrator dies 3/4 of the way through the story does pose a little bit of a problem. So I played around with different ways to do that. I thought about maybe making it, should I switch to another character? I thought about that. Where should he be located if it's going to be him? And finally, I did what I always did when I was stuck, which is that I tried to go back to the originals. And I thought, well, how did the ancient Greeks think about, how did Homer think about the afterlife and the underworld? And you know, if you were a spirit and you were unburied, you still existed very much as a consciousness. And so I really just tried to kind of think, well, what do I see in Homer? What's the evidence I have? How can I work with that and be inspired by that? And so that's really where it came from. It was incredibly beautiful. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. If anyone else has questions?
This is going to sound like one question, but it's actually 2. First, I want to know in what way your understanding of Mycenaean culture influenced the writing of this. And secondly, were you at all inspired by any current writers or former writers of fantasy, given the fantastical elements in your novel?
I'm going to take the second part first. Yes, I think I was. For me, it's always hard to identify particular influences, but there were many, many fantasy writers that I have been inspired by over the years. And I read a lot of fantasy when I was a child, because for me, Greek mythology and fantasy seemed like the same thing. And you know, yeah, that's right. And if you were going to put Homer, you know, if you were going to put him in something other than poetry, now, and you weren't thinking about this 3,000-year-old history, you would probably put him in fantasy. And so I guess I would point out, if I had to name particular names, certainly Ursula K. Le Guin. The Wizard of Earthsea books are beautiful. She has such, I feel like she is so underappreciated in some ways for her prose, which is just really beautiful and elegant. And I liked, he's not really a fantasy novelist, but he is a modern novelist, which is David Mitchell. He's one of my absolute favorite novelists. I love Cloud Atlas is coming out. I'm excited to see the movie, but the book was incredible, those of you who read it. And I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, or de Zoet, however you say it, that was also an amazing book. And Hilary Mantel, I have to say, right now I'm just in awe of Hilary Mantel. Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, they're not quite fantasy, but they are, in fact, they're not fantasy at all. But, but she is just looming very large in my mind right now. I just think she is at the top of her craft, so amazing. What she's able to pull together and the characterization that she's able to draw out is just blows my mind. And now for the Mycenaean part. I certainly researched Mycenaean culture, and when I felt like Homer was silent about something, I would often go to research about Mycenaean culture, but I really was trying to keep in my mind that Homer was my world. I wasn't trying to recreate that Mycenaean world. And Homer is full of anachronisms, and that's you know, he was working without a research library, you know, based totally on oral tradition, some of which is maybe a little bit patchwork. So, you know, I wanted to welcome that. Sure.
About the centaur, I think in the book you created so many moments like the one you read about the two boys, and certainly the ending, are unforgettable in their emotional power. And I think one of the other moments that is especially powerful is the departure from the mountaintop where the centaur has them. And I think what must it have been like for you as a writer, and for us as the reader, well, those of us who know the story, so that Chiron knows that the boys will never come back. The boys, maybe Patroclus senses that, but Achilles seems to be oblivious. And I think that moment, that tension of that departure is excruciating and overpowering for me, at least as a reader. And I thought, what's it like for an author to create these characters and then let them go? You never saw Chiron, you couldn't bring them back.
It's true. And there were some characters that I would have loved to digress on a whole lot more. And in fact, there's a lot of Hector on the cutting room floor, because Hector is one of my favorite characters in the ancient stories. And those of you who know the Iliad know that in many ways he's the hero. He's the most noble character in the story, even though he's the enemy. So it was hard, and actually it was the thing that surprised me most maybe about finishing the book is what a sense of grief I felt when I finished it. And there were a couple of days where I kind of walked around like a zombie, thinking I'm never going to write another page for this story or for these characters. And it was very sad, actually.